Hey everyone, welcome to Locked On Lakers for Monday. Brian Kamenetsky and Andy Kamenetsky. It's Darvin Ham introduction day. What should people expect? What do we want to hear? Not just from Darvin Ham, but also from Rob Pelinka. That's next.
You are Locked On Lakers, your daily Los Angeles Lakers podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Thanks to everybody for making Locked On Lakers your first listen of every day, Monday through Fridays, sometimes on weekends, and especially when breaking news hits. We've always got fresh Lakers content for you. Locked On Lakers on YouTube is where you go to get the podcast a little bit early. It pops up there generally a few hours before the straight audio product. I want to let you know that today's episode is brought to you by BetOnline. BetOnline has you covered this season with more props, odds, and lines than ever before. BetOnline, where the game starts. So some interesting stuff about Austin Reaves that we want to try to get into over the course of the show. But Andy, of course, the big news today, Darvin Ham is being introduced to the Lakers media, Lakers Nation, presumably
later today.
Yeah, presumably not the Lakers. They've already met him. But at the very least, I think we can all agree that the context and the circumstances around Ham's introductory press conference are going to be better than the ones around Frank Vogel's.
Yeah, that was an absolute bleep show because the entire lead up to Vogel eventually being hired and introduced, you had you had the team missing the playoffs. Then you had Magic Johnson abruptly quitting in an impromptu press conference that nobody, including Jeannie Buss, had any idea was coming. Actually, it was funny. Everybody thought the story of that last day for the Lakers was going to be Luke Walton getting fired, if not that evening. Shortly thereafter, that word would start trickling out. And I was at that press conference, and Luke Walton did his final or what turned out to be his final presser. But at the time, he even acknowledged, like, hey, I understand what's being talked about, and just I have no control over this. Whatever happens, happens. Concentrating on coaching, blah, blah, blah. And then
he actually handed you his key card afterward.
And that was an indication that he had a pretty good idea of where things were headed. But then, like, right after Luke spoke, Magic strolls in and he says to Allison Bogley, who at the time was in charge of media relations for the Lakers, I want to do a press conference. And everybody in the beginning thought he was just joking. It was just Magic being Magic, making a joke about the media being around there. He wanted to talk. But then he moves behind the dais and everyone's like, oh, Magic is going to
really talk.
And I thought, and I think other people thought, that he would be giving clarity on Luke's situation one way or the other. Either we have decided to let Luke Walton go. We've decided Luke Walton is not being let go. So we want to put this to bed. This is the direction moving forward, whatever. And then ended up announcing that he was leaving in part because he and Jeannie couldn't see eye to eye on Luke Walton's future. Luke ends up leaving anyway.
Right. But it wasn't just that. It was the
right.
And then the
Brian, I was just getting warmed up.
Right. It's the
this was the appetizer.
Rob Pelinka is a backstabber, and I mean, like this long process, which is
Ty Lue, Monty Williams,
but it's punctuated.
Jason
all
Kidd.
Of it punctuated by total silence from the organization.
Yeah,
and Rob
Pelinka did not speak during exit interviews. That year,
no, he didn't. And so you had this, weeks long stretch where you didn't hear from the organization, and between that process and, Ty Lue not being the coach here, Monty Williams choosing the dumpster fire that is the Phoenix Suns, but then especially still run by Robert Sarver, who's not considered a top-notch owner over the Lakers.
Person.
No, bad person.
Yeah.
And, Vogel's press conference where he was an afterthought because there was every question was aimed at Rob, and Frank, to his credit, did a great job. But
it took multiple questions in that press conference before Frank Vogel got his first.
Yes,
like the first
many.
5 or 6,
and then
minimum.
I don't know how many more before he got his second. But like it was like, no, we got a lot. But when you combine that with and this is what I think is important, when you combine that with the process of how Frank Vogel was treated and then fired, process was a huge thing that people were looking at. And I don't know if Darvin Ham is going to be a great coach. I like the hire. I think of the 3 candidates, we spent a lot of time last week going into this. We thought he was the best one, but we don't know it's going to work out. But I will say this, the Lakers' process this time around was significantly better. I don't want to say put the Vogel thing to bed because, we learned on Sunday that Quinn Snyder, for example, isn't going to return to Utah. Very obviously had no interest in the Lakers job because if he wanted this job, the Lakers would have, none of this happened while the job was still available.
I have heard from a couple people
right.
who I consider pretty good sourcing on this that Quinn Snyder was not interested
was
in
not
the job,
interested.
And the Lakers knew that he was not interested.
Correct. And that is it's not irrelevant broadly speaking, because I think it probably has to do with where the team is, how they've treated Frank Vogel. A lot of those things play into it. But for the process that they had with the coaches they had available, they did a good job. And what we're going to see on Monday because of it is a coherent, appropriate and optimistic feeling press conference where the Lakers can have a good reset. The focus will be on Darvin Ham, on moving forward, on a continuity of voice and all these other things that Lakers fans have wanted to see. We're going to get that on Monday. And it's just one day. It's just one press conference. But if anybody remembers what the bleep show was like, what is that, 3.25 years ago or whatever it is, I'll take Monday's process over that 1,000 times out of 1,000.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's a given necessarily. We won't see until later today exactly the ratio of questions to Frank Vogel. Questions to Darvin Ham versus questions to Rob Pelinka, because there still is a fair amount of uncertainty around the organization. But what I will say is Darvin Ham I'm willing to make this prediction right now. Darvin Ham will not feel like an afterthought at this press conference. And we're going to get into later in this show some of the things that we're curious before we hear these answers, just sort of the things we would like to see him talk about. And hopefully, question, we both plan on being there, questions that we would like to ask or that other people would ask, that sort of thing. Some of the stuff that we are hoping that will get addressed. But I am very confident that Ham is not going to feel like the B story at his first introduction to fans. I don't mean to
say that there won't be hard questions asked of Rob. I'm sure somebody will ask him about, does he feel that the process was impacted by the way they let Frank go?
Before, Vogel might as well might as well have not attended the thing.
Right.
That is no exaggeration.
And this sort of atmosphere of controversy won't be the theme. The Lakers we can carry this through. The Lakers have tremendous challenges still in front of them. This doesn't, Darvin Ham doesn't fix that stuff. The roster is still problematic to say the very least. But it's this part of it isn't going to be where the controversy lies. And so let's get into it though. What do you want to hear from Rob Pelinka? What do you want to hear from Darvin Ham Monday when he speaks to Lakers media and Lakers Nation really gets a chance to get to know the guy? So we'll do that next.
Locked On Lakers brought to you by BetOnline, your number one source for all your betting stats and sports info. Find all the latest sports developments, league reviews, news, including NBA playoffs, NHL playoffs, baseball, boxing, MMA, NFL futures, the whole nine. You can find it all at BetOnline, BetOnline.net. They got some NBA Finals props up right now. Also, you can bet on the first overall pick in the upcoming NBA draft. The odds makers currently like Jabari Smith Jr. going first overall, followed by Chet Holmgren, who sounds like a really obnoxious prep school kid. Like, might be a lovely person, but that's what the name reeks
or
of.
like a bebop jazz artist
Yeah.
from like from 67.
Yeah, it's what Chet Baker could have chosen as his stage name instead of Chet Baker. And then you've got Paolo Banchero going number 3. BetOnline, your continued source for all your sporting wagering information, from live betting to playoffs, esports, and more. So head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more about the trends in action. BetOnline, where the games start.
Quick favor to ask you guys. We have a survey so we can learn more about what listeners like you prefer in all of your Locked On podcasts like this one and all the others across the network. So this is your chance to tell us what you like and what you don't like. Go to lockedonpodcast.com/survey right now to get started. It's really short. Everybody who completes the survey has a chance to win one of 10 $100 Ticketmaster gift cards. So again, lockedonpodcast.com/survey. Thanks for your help there. What are you interested in hearing from both, I guess, from Rob Pelinka and Darvin Ham? Who do you want to start with, Rob or Darvin?
Let's start with Darvin because, again,
Okay.
it's actually his day. Let's start getting in the habit of treating the actual coach like he matters. One of the questions I would want to know is, what did the team signal they wanted from you as a coach? Just because, as I've said many times, Brian, I've never gotten a sign over the last decade that they know what they want in a coach. So I'd be curious to hear what they signaled to Darvin that they want. I would be curious to know what he learned over the course of his career, both as a player and as a coach, just about star dynamics, like not necessarily how to coach or manage stars, but just how do those dynamics shape the overall vibe and character of a team? Like, do stars ultimately define who the team is?
Yeah.
And what were the questions you asked Rob Pelinka and Joey Buss, Jesse Buss, Kurt Rambis? Like, what were the questions you asked of the organization?
I was just thinking, like, when it was like when they asked you questions, we're like, I'm such a hard worker. Like, if I have a big flaw, it's that I care too much about the job. I'm just too passionate about basketball. Yeah, it'd be interesting to hear that, because I think one of the things that the Lakers have learned, and one of the things that I think is becoming more true across the league, is that it's a star-driven league, but who your star is matters. What kind of personality they have matters, and how you put those things together matters. I am a big Kevin Durant fan. I think, sometimes I think the petty he displays online is unnecessary because he's Kevin Durant, but hey, whatever gets you motivated is fine with me.
Sometimes
But,
it's also awesome.
it's often awesome. It's just like I just wonder sometimes, like, do you need to be trolling your inbox that much on Twitter? But like, when you put those things together with James Harden and with Kyrie Irving, like, maybe the basketball thing would have worked there, but personality wise, it was just destined to fail relatively quickly.
I know. I thought it would.
Right, but I mean, they could, if everybody gotten healthy the way they were, like the precious few games they played there, they might have been able to get a season or two of on-court success, but eventually it was gonna fall apart. How as a head coach do you diagnose that stuff? Do you say to your organization, we have a star in LeBron James or Anthony Davis that we think can work with basically anybody, which I think is relatively true.
Yes.
Of the Lakers stars, I think LeBron is a very coachable GOAT candidate, which is saying something. But like, you have to have a pulse on how your stars are with change, how your stars are with pushback, how your stars are with pushback from role players and all that kind of stuff. And I think that's one of the reasons the Lakers like him, is he has a really long experience with that sort of thing.
The man got shot in the face, Brian. He's not going to be afraid of LeBron James.
No.
I'm just saying, like, I mean, there's an old saying, Brian, you get shot in the face, you develop courage.
I thought you were going to say the old saying is you get shot in the face, you're not scared of LeBron James. It's a very specific old saying. I would really want to know from him, because he's got obviously a good reputation as an X's and O's guys. Like you can't get to his level without a deep understanding of basketball.
Yeah, because you're not going to be given the automatic benefit of a doubt if you're not a star in his situation. Like someone like Steve Nash, for example, was able to jump the line with literally no basketball coaching, experience whatsoever, because he's Steve Nash.
Right.
I mean, that
and he's sort of known as a sort of a savant in that way.
Right, but that doesn't happen if you're not a star, too. I mean, like Rajon Rondo is a basketball savant. He's probably at the border of what you could get away with theoretically jumping the line with no experience whatsoever.
Jason Kidd was a good example of that.
Right, exactly. Darvin Ham ain't that dude.
Right. What
from his NBA playing career.
But I don't know, is he an X's and O's guru on offense? Is he I probably would imagine he's pretty good at all that. But what is his idea as the head coach? What are the things, like how important is that relative to locker room management, so to speak, to personality management? Now, like when you move from assistant to head coach, how does that change? Like which are the X's and O's as important as your ability to communicate, your ability to be, a really effective manager of people? I personally have always believed that the latter is much more important. You have a staff for X's and O's, for drawing up plays, for coming up with game plans and stuff like that. You have stars on the floor who ultimately are going to be doing a lot of that stuff, particularly when your star is LeBron. Who sees those things as well as any assistant you're going to be having on your bench anyway.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people think when you have LeBron, the system is LeBron.
Yes.
And there's some truth to that.
For good cause.
Yeah.
So it's the changes from assistant coach to head coach that I think are interesting, because we've seen it a lot of times where you move one seat over in any sport. Bullpen, bench coach to manager in baseball. First, the lead assistant, associate head coach to actual head coach. And it's just a different deal. Coordinator to head coach in football. And so that's the thing that I'd love to hear from him, is just what about your job experience now changes because of the job title. I suspect that this is something that he's thought about for years, is very well prepared in terms of answering and how he'd like to approach it. And I suspect it was something he was asked by the Lakers.
No, yeah. I mean, as you said, this is something he has been prepping for a decade plus, including when he was an assistant with the Lakers, granted under a completely different regime, although I'm sure Joey Buss and Jesse Buss developed, and probably Kurt Rambis developed some degree of familiarity with Darvin Ham at the time, but
sure.
But still, a lot of time has passed. And then to Rob Pelinka, I mean, the number one question I would want to ask him is just how concerned has he been about the revolving door at coach and the importance placed on stopping it? Like, not even just, okay, we need to get a good hire right now, but you'll see, not necessarily with the Lakers, although you can find examples like Byron Scott the last 2 years with Kobe, where he was very specifically hired to be like the caretaker of Kobe's twilight. And then if he happened to gel with the young kids, which he did not, bonus, but otherwise it seemed like they were pretty prepared to send him out the door if that part wasn't going to work. Like, you will often see coaches get hired because they seem like they are a specific fit for a specific group at a specific place in their time together. I want to know how much importance was placed on the idea of this could be a long-term fit for us, because they need to find that guy. It's really important that this door stops revolving.
Yeah. My question to Rob is less about Darvin, because I assume he thinks that this is going to be a long-term long-term relationship. One of the things that will help with that is having some continuity with the roster. I would be very interested to find out from Rob Pelinka how they plan on developing any kind of continuity, um, not just from last year to this year, because that's going to be very difficult to do. But I don't know, say where you might have 3 or 4 guys a year who return who aren't your 2 stars. This treadmill that they're on puts the coaches and puts the team in a very difficult spot. And I would be too many varies in there, but I'd be especially curious to find out how they plan on getting off of it. Speaking of the roster, though, Andy, one of the guys that they are bringing back this year will be presumably will be could bring back is Austin Reaves. And there a couple of times Austin has popped up in the news with things that he's been working on, different ways that he might be used next season. He is a fascinating guy to look at in terms of trying to figure out where he plugs into a roster with a hopefully more competitive team. And so we'll ask that question next. All right. So Austin Reaves, one of the very few bright spots from a miserable 21-22 season.
He was just the Arkansas boys, Brian. It was just Austin Reaves and Malik Monk.
Yeah, that was basically it. And I think, obviously Reaves proved himself to be a credible NBA player. Like, he is at this level, no question. There were times during the season where I think people got a little bit too excited about, Reaves's play and his impact and his potential and the amount that he needed to play. And I think over the course of the season, there were moments when he tailed off, and certainly his shooting, from the outside, I think he finished for about 31% from 3-point range, which is not good. And he slumped at points near the end of the season. Figuring out what he is a really important factor. It's very similar to what the Lakers had to try to do with THT and kind of failed at it. When you look at Reaves, do you see a high-end rotation guy, middle? What do you see when you look at him?
Well, in certain respects, I think what Austin Reaves is, at least for the time being, is very defined by how good is his team. Mm-hmm. Because his greatest utility, at least right now, is going to be filling in the spaces on a really good team. Like, if you put him on a high-end team, similar to how Alex Caruso, who was developing in his earlier stints with the Lakers, up and down from the G League squad, you could see that Caruso was getting better.
Both of their value is predicated a lot on IQ. It's on being, it's not just making, but it's being in the right spot, the little stuff, the angles, the nuances that go in with rotations and making the right pass at the right time, being 2 feet further to your right so you can receive a pass, like all that little stuff. Both of those guys were excellent at that. And that works better when you're playing with better players, because the guys around you, the 4 other players, are also doing those things. When you're playing with inexperienced, disorganized young players, the precision isn't there. And so then you are more reliant on your one-on-one ability or pure athleticism and all that stuff. And both Caruso and Reaves, maybe in different ways, are probably underrated as athletes. Caruso particularly.
Caruso's a really good
athlete. But they're not.
Their games aren't predicated on athleticism. And like you said, it just makes it easier for both of them to do the things that they're good at, especially too, Caruso at the time, Austin Reaves right now, while they were still gaining experience and still just learning the NBA game, not having them do too much greatly benefits them and the team. But it's interesting. Austin Reaves was on the Lakers Nation's podcast with Trevor Lane and Matt Peralta, and he talked about wanting to play or being open to playing more point guard. That just got both of us thinking more about like the different things that Reaves could be doing on this team. I started looking at his splits because over the course of the season, he started getting more responsibilities. There was that brief period where he got benched, but then he was back in the lineup pretty quickly. And it seemed like Frank Vogel had sensed that he might have been hitting a bit of a rookie wall. So he just wanted to give him, a little bit of a break, let him catch his legs again. He averaged 2.3 assists in the month of March, which was double what he had averaged in February. And that's while playing the exact same minutes, basically, like a minute and a half more, and with pretty much the same usage rate. Went up a couple ticks, but not anything where you'd look at it and say that's startlingly high. As the year went on, he started looking more comfortable doing a little bit more along those lines, being a secondary playmaker, stuff like that. And you started seeing signs of him being able to do it without turning the ball over much, which was a good sign.
It depends on what when you think of a point guard, a lot of times in the NBA, you think of, Ja Morant, pushing pace, scoring. That's not going to be Austin Reaves as your point guard. He is, but you don't need that with LeBron as your, LeBron is essentially a point guard. What you want is a second guy who can do that on the floor, but not in a high usage way. And, I think Reaves would qualify in that way. The really tricky part here is how often guys would have the opportunity to do that if Russ is still on the team. I mean, I think this is the argument, one of the best arguments for addition by subtraction, as long as you're not giving up too much to get rid of Russ, is that you then free up Reaves maybe to do more stuff, and THT especially to do more stuff.
I was going to say, is he playing off the bench with THT? Because right now, unless THT starts becoming better with his outside shot, better as an off-ball guy, you need him more as like a primary on-ball player, because otherwise
to penetrate and kick and push or at the very least somebody coming off screens to catch the ball on the move, and be moving downhill to the basket. And it is difficult for me to try to know, because THT is still 21, correct?
Yeah, I think he turns 22 later this year.
Austin Reaves 24, turned 24. So, there is still room for improvement. He's going to get more accustomed to the NBA game. His intelligence will grow. His experience will grow. All of that. But it is probably unreasonable to assume massive jumps in his game.
You know what? I don't know if I agree with that. I don't agree with that.
I think he can become incrementally a better shooter, which would make a huge difference. I'm not saying it's impossible, but generally speaking, as you start to get into 24, 25, 26, people start to become relatively what they are. There are exceptions, but people are relatively what they're going to be.
Here's where I would say would be the exception, though, with somebody specifically like an Austin Reaves, or I think actually Alex Caruso becomes another good comp here. I think it's different for guys who are like 24, 25 and then enter the league, because it's a different track in terms of where you are in your NBA basketball development, as opposed to a guy who entered the league at 20, has been in the league for like 4 years at age 24, 25. Then I think you might have more of an idea, more definitively, of who they are. Austin Reaves has only played 1 year of NBA basketball. So I think it's a little bit different than the way you might track other guys.
It's true.
Because Caruso is a profoundly better player now than he was just a couple years ago, despite being 28.
Right. I think it's
way better now.
He's sort of entering his prime, but I think it helps that he is built around defense. And so, that it's one of those things where his greatest value is on the defensive side of the ball. Austin Reaves in the next year or two as a 35 or 36% three-point shooter is a profoundly different player than as a 30. And that's gonna be a lot of catch and shoot. That's gonna be so in those kinds of places, I am optimistic that because he does play well with other good players, that he could actually be a pretty good, solid, useful, not kind of a passing fad player for the Lakers next year, if they can put a good enough team around them to make him useful.
Yeah, you want him to accentuate what you have. You don't want to rely on him to be a catalyst. Like at least at least at this stage of his career, maybe he develops further than anybody
I think
thinks.
that's probably what he becomes over the course of his career, but particularly as a second round pick, that's really valuable.
He wasn't a second round pick. He was.
Undrafted free agent. Yeah, I'm thinking of THT.
Yeah, he needs to put on some weight too. He needs to put on
which
some
he will,
muscle.
and strength will help.
Yep.
And all that stuff.
As much as he is a better defender than his experience would belie, and he knows the places he's supposed to go. He works well in a team concept. You can bully him. Yeah. You can, and teams did bully him.
So I would put him right now as a contextual starter on a good team, but certainly a legit rotation player.
Okay.
If your team is good enough. A bad team, he actually doesn't. I'm not sure how much he would play. All right, so we'll see what happens on Monday with the Darvin Ham press conference. We'll have all the reaction to that. Do want to let you know that you should check out the Locked On NBA Big Board with host Rafael Barlow from the NBA Draft Junkies and author of the Big Board newsletter. He's joined by Richard Stamen, Sam Ferris, Lee Thulin. Get an in-depth look into the NBA draft, mock drafts, player rankings, all that stuff. It's free wherever you get your podcasts. Locked On Lakers on YouTube. It's where you go to get this show. Thanks for making Locked On Lakers your first listen of every day. We'll see everybody Tuesday.